say, struggling with a porn addiction, thinking about changing your patterns, so not using your phone after 9 p.m. at night, switching it off or something, and just changing your patterns of behaviour.
The intemperate person just really is living life out of control because they're being completely dominated by their desires. So temperance isn't about being free from desire, but not being controlled by pleasure.
But does temperance then remove joy? Is the temperate person joyless?
So important to all of our life to be able to be deeply attentive. I think attention actually is the condition of being able to love, and the person whose attention is completely fragmented is never capable of contemplation.
Hello, I'm Father John.
Hello, I'm Fr Toby.
And welcome to Good Habits, our podcast exploring questions of meaning through the tradition of the virtues. And today we come on to the virtue of temperance, which is all to do with our desires. Should we be free from desire? Is desire a good thing? Pleasures, what should we think about our pleasures? How can I grow in self-control is one of the questions. And I was reading recently an article from a Guardian columnist who was giving his kind of predictions for the new year and saying his advice for what 2026 should be all about. And he said, this year, give yourself permission to prioritise pleasure. Is that good advice?
I wonder whether people weren't doing that before. It doesn't seem to me that we're particularly in a state in our cultural moment where people aren't. But no, I think it's terrible advice. Because I think actually what people will be searching for in pleasure, they won't find. They'll think that pleasure, if they just had enough pleasure, they'd be completely happy. But I would want to say, and I think Aquinas would want to say without putting words in his mouth, which I'm not, that actually you won't find the joy that you desire in infinite pleasure.
And so what's temperance in this picture? How does temperance relate to pleasure?
Yeah, so temperance is another one of those virtues, a bit like prudence, where we said, lacks a little bit of razzmatazz in the name.
Needs a branding manager.
Temperance isn't thought of as a particularly sexy virtue, although actually it relates quite a lot to that issue. Exactly. Yeah. Very good. Came up with that just now. Nice, quite pleased. That it's about the moderation of our concupiscible passions through reason. So properly ordered bodily desiring.
What are concupiscible passions?
So these we might think of as our sort of gut desires. We don't have to think about them; they just happen to us. So the example I gave, and it's one I go to time and time again, because if I see a steak, I love it. The steak is good. I recognise it as good, and because it's good, I naturally love it. And the things that I love, I desire to be united with, which in steak terms means putting it in my mouth, probably chewing. And then when I've got that medium rare ribeye, just in case you want to take me out for a steak sometime, not sponsored by them, but Hawksmoor is outstanding, taken there by friends. I'm eating the steak and I feel pleasure. So we've got this basic dynamic of desiring, which is loving the good thing, then desiring it, and then in union with it, experiencing pleasure.
So when we say pleasure is fundamentally a good thing?
Yes, because if you think about the person who had no natural desire for food, this would be a bit of a problem. And it's interesting actually with young children, babies very naturally want to feed and they cry all the time. But then toddlers seem to go through a phase where actually they don't actually desire all that they need in order to grow and to do well. I don't know why they go through these phases, but you'll see lots of parents sort of battling with their children to try and make them want to eat more and to try and incentivize it. Not just incentivizing to eat vegetables, but just incentivizing to eat something full stop. And so it's good that we take pleasure in things that are good for us.
But why do we not prioritize pleasure then? If pleasure is a good thing, why shouldn't we just pursue it?
Because pleasure, as we're using the word, corresponds primarily to our bodily desiring. And this is what the concupiscible passions are about. They're about our bodily desires. But as we've discussed the different parts of the human person's soul, that we're made for more than simply the satisfaction of our bodily desiring, that we experience this greater joy in friendship, in the company of people that we love, in listening to beautiful music, contemplating fantastic art. And so if I only live life on the level of seeking the satisfaction of my bodily desires, I'm living something that's less than human. Nonetheless, the person who takes no pleasure in food, and who, when somebody has created a really beautiful meal for them, can't enjoy that, can't give thanks to them, we would say, well, they're actually lacking something. And God is the giver of all good things, and if we don't enjoy all the good things that he gives, but there is this very real danger. G.K. Chesterton once said that the Catholic Church saves us from spirituality. And you think, what? No. Well, it's because the Catholic understanding of the human person takes the whole human person seriously, including the fact that we are embodied.
So is temperance repressing our pleasures? Is it moderating them? Is it freeing us in some sense?
I think it's freeing us and making sure that our pleasures participate in reason, and that we don't get controlled by our desire for pleasure seeking, such that we get taken away from the pursuit of higher things in life. I mentioned in a previous episode about sort of addiction, and I think when we're looking at sort of temperance there, we very much can see the problems of addiction to pleasure. And we tend to think of addiction largely just in relation to sort of drugs and alcohol, but there are many, many other forms of addiction going on right now that we might talk about. But one excellent writer in a really, really brilliant book that I read called Addiction and Virtue, he describes drug addicts as being the prophets of our age, because he says they show the failure of society to provide any other transcendent good worth fully orienting one's life towards. And the one thing you see with a drug addict is they will always get their drugs that day. And we're called to be like that, but for the sake of a higher good, to actually prioritize everything for the sake of a higher good, be willing to forego other things for the pursuit of what is best. What you see in the case of the addict, be it to food, pornography, alcohol, you see that they have placed a lower priority and completely ordered their lives around this, which is why you need the virtue of temperance to ensure that our bodily desiring, and we're principally talking about our two main sort of bodily desires here, for food and for drink, call them as one, another one for sex. And these things are essential to keeping humanity going. Yeah. If we don't eat and drink, we die. And if nobody has sex, well, there's no future generations to come. So it's good that God has made these things enjoyable and pleasurable, but they're not the ultimate end of being human.
So how, in a kind of practical level, how do we go about developing this virtue and acquiring it? Because it seems clearly it's not about just repressing desires and avoiding every kind of exposure to something that might be pleasurable. But on the other hand, if you've got a difficulty with alcohol, you're not going to go and just constantly sit in a pub around the bar and expose yourself to alcohol. So what's the right way of mediating that? I think,
first of all, as we said all along with virtue, like we've got to bring reason into this. So examine, and I think it's really helpful in general in life, to examine the pattern of my life and to think, why am I doing the things that I'm doing? And if we're starting to put on a lot of weight, like so many people often say like, oh, I didn't realize that actually I was snacking every single night when I was watching TV. Yeah. Like I thought, like, why am I getting so fat? Yeah. Because I'm not eating that much more. But then I realized that actually I'm doing this every night when I watch TV. So to bring our reason into it, to look at the bigger pattern of our life and to think intentionally about, why do I do the things that I do? So say one example of intemperance, I would say in a way that people probably don't think about it a great deal, is if you spend 45 minutes deciding what restaurant to go to for dinner, reading through review after review after review about like where's got the best well, steak in my case is a really obvious one, but also quite partial to Chinese. Like where's got the best dim sum? I used to love that when I lived in Hong Kong, and I used to actually like read up quite a lot, like where can I get the best siu mai or something like that. If you're spending 45 minutes deciding where to go and eat that, but you're not spending 45 minutes in prayer, then you can see the good that you've assigned to eating versus the good that you've assigned to your relationship with God has got distorted. And also probably if your enjoyment of a meal depends upon it being the best food in the world versus depends upon who you're eating it with, then you've got a problem there as well. So examine like why you're doing what you're doing, and what are you hoping to get out of it. Obviously with an alcoholic, I don't think they're going to find at the bottom of the glass what they were looking for. There's a reason, and people speak about sort of eating or drinking your feelings. There's a reason these things can take on an inordinate importance in our life, and we have to examine like why is that?
I think it also it points to what's been kind of a recurring theme in our conversations about the centrality of prudence with all the virtues, and that self-knowledge. And something else, picking up on what we discussed in the prudence episode, on prudence is in some sense also a communal virtue. We exercise our self-knowledge by relying on the docility, the guidance of others. And I think that especially applies here with temperance. It can be a real help to rely on the friendship of others to spot things, patterns in your life where particularly those who've known you for a long time, can see something, a pattern developing that's possibly unhealthy with eating or whatever it might be.
Yeah, and then like I know I shouldn't go into a Poundland if I'm hungry. Yeah, someone's going to Poundland to like buy deodorant or toothbrushes or the things that are cheap in there. If I go in when I'm hungry, I will like buy a load of rubbish that I did not need, that I did not intend to eat. But then once it's back in the Priory, you end up eating it in the same way that the person who's struggling with alcohol, don't walk past the pub on the way home that you always used to get drunk in. Like go a different way home. Environmental factors sort of affect us. And so, we see again, prudence taking a really important role in the exercise of all the other virtues. I read a story when I was doing a paper on addiction about in the Vietnam War that loads of the US military got very addicted to sort of opioids out there, and the US authorities were exceptionally worried about like what's going to happen when you bring tens of thousands of men back who are all addicted to opiates. And they sent out medical teams there to try and run drug rehabilitation out there, and it didn't work at all. And then all the men came back, and most of them stopped using, simply because all of the environmental factors around both the stress triggers, but also the place that you associated with the eating, the dealer that you would have gone to, all the little environmental triggers that would result in them using the drug were no longer there. So it can sometimes feel incredibly childish, the things that we have to do to grow in temperance. Like, I mustn't open the packet of biscuits because I know when I open them I always end up eating the whole packet, or it's safer just not to have biscuits. And that's not properly having the virtue.
Yeah.
Now having the virtue would be being able to have just one biscuit when I chose to have one biscuit, and taking enjoyment in that and not desiring a whole load more. In the same way that, I don't know whether you find this, I didn't eat a lot of cake before I entered Dominican life.
You get given a lot of cake.
You get a lot of cake. and I'm not saying to the nice ladies largely who bake them, like, don't keep them coming. Do.
Yeah.
But you can have the situation there where, particularly when it's very good cake, and there are some pretty skilled bakers out there, that you have a slice, and there's 10 slices and there's 10 of you in the community. And you're like, that was good. And then you start thinking to yourself, oh, Father Peter, I know he's not a big fan of like cake, or I know that he said to me that he was like trying to cut back a little bit. So I'd be doing him a favor if I were to eat that. Or I think Father Rudolph, he's out late tonight, so he probably won't want it when we come. And we see how we start to use our reason to try and justify our unreasonable desire for this food.
Yeah. It strikes me with environmental factors is so important here, and that's also really relevant to chastity. And a lot of people say struggling with a porn addiction, thinking about changing your patterns. So not using your phone after 9 p.m. at night, switching it off or something, and just changing your patterns of behavior, because human life can be very predictable. Addictive patterns mean you tend to do the same thing at the same time of day in the same place for the same reasons. And also means you can kind of see something coming. You know that it tends to be when I'm more tired, or when you're more frustrated or something, that tends to be, you can see something coming. And changing your environment is about being prudent, saying, I know this is a time when I might be vulnerable. And I was thinking of Christ in the Gospels saying, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. So obviously not literally maiming ourselves, but you can be very intentional and prudent about occasions of sin, changing your environment to protect yourself, and then growing in the virtue.
Yeah, and when Jesus sort of criticizes like the man who calls his brother a fool,
yes,
I think that in that passage, like we've got a teaching on growth in the virtues, going that the little stuff really does matter.
Yes,
and that you can't expect to be heroic in the big stuff if you've not first developed the virtue in the smaller stuff. And there's the song, "Don't Sweat the Small Stuff." Great song, but don't listen to the sentiment. Sweat the small stuff, because that's where you're forming yourself.
These virtues grow in the daily habits, the daily practices.
Yeah, and I think I'm glad you sort of brought up sort of pornography, because whilst Aquinas talks about temperance relating to bodily pleasures, I think in the kind of the Instagram and the scrolling world, there is a sensible pleasure. What we see often with Instagram and pornography is the corruption of beauty. So it appeals to us on the level of beauty when we're supposed to delight in beauty, but what we have is this corruption, this pornification of it. And one of the biggest dangers is that, at least with food, we get to the point where we can't eat anymore. But you get the case of so many people now who are like seriously struggling with their sleep, because you can scroll and you can scroll and you can scroll. It's like infinite shallows. It's got no depth. You can just keep on scrolling and you'll never get full. And then people start to kind of seek out other stuff in order to try and get the hit that they used to get from the other stuff. But I think this is the thing that's so pernicious about it, is that we don't reach a kind of a satiation or a bloatedness in the same way that you would with food or drink, or, there's only so much sex somebody can be having, at a time, whereas with the scrolling, it can just go on and on and on.
It's kind of gluttony at its worst.
Yeah, it's a gluttony with the eyes.
Yeah, interesting. Another word, I think, if I'm getting it correctly, that St. Thomas uses for this is curiosity as a vice, curiositas. And of course, curiosity is a good kind of curiosity. We know lots of schools have it as one of their virtues, and there's a good kind of curiosity. But what St. Thomas is getting at here, as I understand it, is essentially a lust of the mind, a disordered kind of knowledge that just thirsts for bite-sized chunks of information that don't satisfy. And at a simple level, kind of getting lost on Wikipedia with the hyperlinks as an example is, I think, you're just kind of curious just for more knowledge, which serves no particular function, just to satisfy your mind. But as you say, this stuff doesn't really ultimately satify, and you just keep going. Yeah,
and you don't end up learning the thing that you intended to
learn.
Yeah, exactly. We've all had that experience, which just is like, what did I come here for?
Yeah.
Like, what am I doing? And we end up, everything is interesting.
Yeah.
G.K. Chesterton, he says there's no such thing as a boring object, only a boring person. But the problem, it's actually finding me boring. The problem's with you. It's not us. Yeah. But the danger is, like, the man who spent all his life like studying the nematodes, loved his worms, and never actually raised his mind up to the study of God. That would be a waste of the intellect. And in the same way, the person who just isn't capable of holding their mind in contemplation or in any one thing.
In terms of that kind of lust of the mind, curiosity, I think I think that St. Thomas has helpfully here to speak of a particular virtue for this, the virtue of the mind that comes under temperance. He calls study. And again, we might think study is sitting down, maybe your friend who loves his worms, that kind of just focus on one thing, or bookishness or so on. But study is something much wider. We can think of maybe as a virtue of attention.
Yes, and I think it's so important to all of our life to be able to be deeply attentive. I think attention actually is the condition of being able to love, and the person whose attention is completely fragmented is never capable of contemplation. And I think so many young people now have a phrase that the youth are using, which never used to get used when I was young, but I think it's because of a very real crisis of attention, where people speak about, I want to be seen.
Interesting.
And I think people who've grown up in an age where actually nobody is properly attentive to them. But yeah, as you see the meme going around, you know, get somebody in your life who looks at you the same way that I saw with one priest who said, like, get somebody who looks in you in your life the same way I look at liturgy books. You know, there is this crisis of attention, and it leads to this deep insecurity in people, and people start doing more and more extreme things then in order to try and get attention.
Yeah. Just slightly moving on, so temperance is about moderating our desires, subjecting them to reason. But does temperance then remove joy? Is the temperate person joyless?
No. I think the temperate person sort of, you know, experiences joy. He can eat his steak and give thanks to God at the same time. The temperate person is St. Paul's cheerful giver, the person who experienced the right level of pleasure in the right things. There's a great pub in Cambridge, the Champion of the Thames, which has a fantastic quote on the outside of the pub, which I'm going to read because, you know, I'd always had too much to drink when I came out and couldn't remember it. No, I'm joking. No. But it says, "This house is dedicated to those splendid fellows who make drinking a pleasure, who reach contentment before capacity, and who, whatever the drink, can take it, hold it, enjoy it, and still remain gentlemen." And I think that's a nice encapsulation of some of the qualities that the person with temperance has, that they enjoy the drink, but they don't want too much. They don't want it to the extent that it starts to become a vicious thing for them that leads them into behaving in ways that they don't want to. So temperance enhances our joy. Father Thomas Joseph White, who lived with us for a while in Oxford, he spoke about Corn Market
the High Street
in Oxford, and he said you walk along there on a Saturday night and you see a whole lot of pleasure but not a great deal of joy.
Yeah, that's well put. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We've spoken quite a bit about gluttony in various forms, and how that actually doesn't just apply to food. Is gluttony quite a serious sin? So in the church we often talk about the difference between mortal and venial sin. Is every mortal being a far more serious, cuts us off from the life of grace and so on, venial less serious? Is gluttony always a mortal sin?
I don't think it's always a mortal sin, but it can start to, I think when we sort of consent to the gluttony with our will, and we say, actually, you know, this is where I'm going to find my ultimate good, and where it sort of cuts us off from other people, when it's just become food has become the orienting factor of my life, then where perhaps sometimes even by a succession of not mortal sin decisions find ourselves in a state of mortal sin. I don't know what you think on that.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think mortal sin requires full knowledge, full consent, and grave matter. And I think so if those three conditions are qualified, then yes, but you can there might not be full consent. For instance, addiction can diminish your consent in some way.
Yeah. Like intemperance, the sins around intemperance, they're not the worst sins, but the problem is the intemperate person just really is living life out of control, because they're being completely dominated by their desires, and generally they're not desiring well. So temperance isn't about being like free from desire, but not being controlled by pleasure, and having sufficient freedom in order to be able to desire that which is going to lead to my greatest happiness, that which is going to give me joy.
It's again about being fully alive, that all of our powers are exercised for their fundamental purpose.
Yeah.
And on that being fully alive, it might be nice to talk a little bit about the spiritual life here as well, the relationship between temperance and prayer, because an inordinate desire of some kind or subjective reason, you gave the example of scrolling through a menu 45 minutes, why not 45 minutes at prayer? But I think there's a closer link as well, no, that a good exercise of temperance does free the mind to pray in some way.
Yeah, if every time I sit down to pray, I'm just constantly thinking, ooh, yes, I'm a little bit peckish. And it might be, you know, I think very often, often when I sit down to study, suddenly I'm like, oh, I quite fancy a coffee, or I could quite do with something. And I could go and have a coffee, and I could go and have the biscuit, and it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. At the same time, once that starts to become a sort of a pattern, and actually then after having the coffee, do I return to the prayer? that we need to actually develop this interior freedom. So I can say, oh yeah, no, I feel that desire now, but that's fine. It's just a bodily desire, and I want to be with you now, God. And in the same way that a friend who was with us, and he kept on, maybe just checking his phone when he's with us the whole time. Like, it might be that there's lots of interesting messages coming in. He might be really interested in the rugby match, or if he's a great guy, the cricket match that's going on at the moment. But if he can't sort of moderate his desire to find out what's going on in order to be completely with you, then there's a real problem there.
The Desert Fathers spoke a lot. Those who lived a life of quite intense asceticism, and we maybe think about the Desert Fathers as sorts of people who just repressed all desires. They lived such extreme asceticism, but I think it's quite the opposite. And one of the virtues they spoke a lot about is discretion, as the word used, which I think we can think of as a kind of a temperance for the mind. And I found it interesting reading that the model for them of this virtue of discretion is the centurion in the Gospels. Jesus encounters a centurion who says, I tell my soldiers to go, and they go. I tell them to come, they come. And that idea that transferred to the spiritual life, that complete ordering and control over one's desires, so you can enjoy pleasurable and good things, but they're always subject to your reason. You have full control. You exercise self-control. And that frees you to enjoy God. That frees you for the spiritual life, to be a person in control of oneself.
Yeah, and temperance is a part of self-mastery. And I was always struck the first time I came across St. John Paul II's Theology of the Body. And he speaks about the dynamic of gift in the Christian life, and Adam on encountering sort of Eve and recognizing his desire to make a gift of himself. But, we cannot make a gift of that which we do not have. And if we haven't got self-possession, then we can't make a gift of ourselves. If we haven't got self-possession, then we can't love properly. And so this is what having the virtue of temperance does. It sets us free in order to be able to love well.
I think that's a beautiful point to wrap up, as we now turn to the theological virtues next, the virtue of faith, thinking particularly about our life with God. Thank you very much, Father Toby.
Thank you, Father John.
Good Habits is a CTS production in collaboration with the Dominican Friars in Britain
and Radio Maria England. And if you've liked this episode, which I sincerely hope you have, then please do like and subscribe.